I was hunting with a friend of mine, Tom, deep in the mountains of Northern California. We went to the top of a ridge to get a good look of the area and try to pick a likely place to find some pigs. I saw a dirt road to the east, a fire trail actually, and was about to ride it off when I noticed a row of campers driving along it. They disappeared behind a hill at the edge of the valley. I then scanned the valley floor and found several other campers near the tree line. Tom suggested we go over there and see if they would share a meal and a warm fire with two worn-out hunters. It was dark by the time we got to the hill they disappeared behind, so we climbed up to get a good last bearing and distance estimate. What we found was surreal. About half a mile away, in the middle of the clearing, was a bonfire. Instinctively, we both dropped to the ground and crawled to some bush for cover overlooking the valley. I scanned the area looking for the camp and any security they might deploy. Tom surveyed the other side of the valley. When he grabbed my arm, I turned around and followed his gaze. There were two groups of people standing near the edge of the valley below us. One was wearing black hooded robes and the other white. A figure carrying a staff and wearing a red hooded robe walked out of the trees towards the fire. The others followed in two single file lines. At the fire, the red figure stopped and raised his arm. The black robes circled clockwise and the white robes counterclockwise until they completely encircled the fire, alternating black and white. We could hear chanting, but we couldn't make out any of the words. After about an hour of chanting and walking around the fire, first in one direction, then the other, they stopped, and a naked man was brought out from the tree line, bound and blindfolded. He was presented to each of the robed figures clockwise around the fire before being presented to the red figure himself. He was then made to lie down on the ground at the red figure's feet. Then, a naked and bound woman was brought out, and the process was repeated counterclockwise before she was laid next to the naked man. I, at least, had no idea what I was watching, or what I should do. There was more chanting, and then silence, as four black-robed figures emerged from the tree line carrying a black robe much like the flag. They circled the fire clockwise once, behind the figures, and once in front of them too. Each black figure touched the robe as it passed. When they arrived at the red figure, they stopped over the naked man. The red figure said something, and the others responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked man, and the four laid the robe over on top of him. After another chant, a white robe was brought out, and the process was repeated counterclockwise, stopping over the naked woman. The red figure said something, and the others responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked woman, and the four laid the robe over on top of her, too. The red figure waved his hands and staff over them, and raised the staff over his head. The robe bearer then picked up the robes as they had before, and the two rose from the ground. The robe bearers then lifted the robes over their heads, and the two then circled the fire twice, embracing each member, first the robes of their color, and then the other. When they got back to the red figure, he pointed towards the camp with his staff, and the new members led the procession back to the camp. I watched them all enter the tree line, and then I looked back to the fire for the red figure. He hadn't moved at all. When the last couple was out of the clearing, the bonfire flashed green, and then red, and then the red robe collapsed to the ground. Needless to say, we sprinted all the way back to our truck that night. We were too scared to stop. The next morning we stopped at a Denny's for breakfast. We had put more than 60 miles between us and the clearing, and that finally felt safe. While we were eating, two couples came in. One sat behind Tom, and the other behind me, so that we saw each of them. They just smiled at us while we ate. When we left, we saw two campers in the parking lot. Tom and I never spoke about that night, and we found a better hunting area far away from that clearing. It has been nearly 40 years since that night, and every once in a while, I come across a couple in a camper, and they just smile at me. My girlfriend at the time and I went camping out in the backwoods of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. We were both 18 years old and drove about 5 hours to get to the camping spot to stay Friday through Sunday. Friday afternoon, we arrived and made camp. I put up the tent and we took a short hike, and then I built a fire and we settled in for the night. No issues so far. Saturday morning, we wake up and get ready for the day of adventuring. We were busy walking miles and miles, and we ran into two different sets of people who were also camping fairly close to where we were. Eventually, the sun surrenders to darkness and out of this area, and nighttime is super dark. We have lanterns and flashlights, but no major issues except for a few mosquitoes. Shortly after around 1 a.m., we turned in for the night. We zipped up our tent, and we were both out pretty quick after a full day of activity. I'm a very light sleeper, and it didn't feel like very long after I fell asleep, I heard a soft rustling sound. Whatever was making the noise, it sounded like it was about 20 yards away from the tent. I looked over at my girlfriend. She was sound asleep. Why can't I sleep like that? I figured that the soft rustling sound was a small animal or something else minor and tried to go back to sleep. Then, though, the soft rustling sound stopped. Then suddenly, in the silence of the night, I heard a thud. It sounded like a decent-sized piece of wood falling onto the forest floor from a couple feet high. It was coming from the same direction the soft rustling sound came from. Again, my girlfriend didn't hear anything and was still asleep. I had to pee anyway, so I began to unzip the tent, and my girlfriend slightly woke up and rolled over asking, "Where are you going?" Not wanting to worry her, I just told her I was going to pee, then grabbed a flashlight and crawled out of the tent, immediately shining the light in the direction the sound was coming from. There was nothing. Just trees, bushes, and total darkness that seemed as if it was swallowing up the beam of my flashlight. I walked around the edge of the campsite looking for anything out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to give up, the flashlight beam caught two reflections out in the dark. They were eyes, and they were looking back at me. I stood there with the flashlight beam locked on the eyes. They appeared low to the ground, didn't seem to be moving, but after a few seconds, the 2 points of light moved to reveal it was nothing but a bunny. I just laughed at myself. I answered nature's call and I returned to the tent. I settled back into my sleeping bag trying to fall asleep, and I was almost there when out of nowhere I heard a very loud noise that seemed to be coming from only a few feet from the tent. It sounded like heavy animal footsteps, like the footsteps of a T-Rex from Jurassic Park. I sat up waiting to hear more sounds while images of what could possibly be making these noises in the middle of the night flashed through my head. I remained awake for another hour and a half or so, until I finally fell asleep for the night. In the morning, some of those nearby campers we had met the day before walked up to our campsite asking if we had heard or seen anything from the night before. My girlfriend began to reply with, "No, we didn't," before I interrupted her and said that I had heard some strange noises. The other campers ran into a wildlife officer who had told them to be on alert, because a bear had been spotted in the vicinity. Southeast Kentucky. It's where the bulk of my family lives, except I have a cousin who grew up elsewhere with my uncle who has money and lives a bit better than most of his kin. My cousin is an artsy guy who was brought up with stories from his dad about the area, and it gave him a very romanticized idea about mountain life. He used to visit a lot as a kid, so he associated the mountains with family and fun and not the crazies I grew up with for some 20 years. Well, he comes in for a visit and has this idea that he's going to go visit and photograph this place called Rebel Rock. His dad has talked it up some, and so it had to be important, right? He just kind of gathered me and my aunt and his wife up and said he knew where to find it, and we were off. I was maybe 16 or 17 at the time, and I realized as we were driving that my aunt was getting noticeably uncomfortable, and I couldn't understand why. It took me a bit to realize that after we had gotten back on this road, and on the way to Rebel Rock, we were driving past a sign that said, "No trespassing." At some point I brought it up and my cousin just waves it off as no big deal. Rebel Rock is a landmark, right? His dad visited it, so it must be open to the public. We finally get to this rock, which is right on the side of the road, and it's completely trashed. My cousin decides to walk further into the woods and leave the rest of us standing outside the car while he's trying to find the perfect angle not covered in beer bottles and graffiti. While we're standing out there, I realize that there's words spray painted on the asphalt right in front of where he parked. "We can see you." So, I freak out, and that prompts my aunt to come over and look, and she just laughs. This is how horror movies start. And that's when I see a glint of light across from us. The way we were parked where Rebel Rock is, we were near the edge of a mountain and directly across another cliff. And if you squinted, you could see light shining off glass across from us. It's a fucking scope. They were using it like binoculars. Suddenly, everybody is yelling at my cousin that we needed to go, now. He has the keys, he dragged us up there, and we're only there basically as prisoners. We're trespassing, and somebody saw us, and trespassing in the mountains is not a good idea. You could meet some irritated old lady, or you could meet somebody cooking meth. You're equally likely to get shot. This was a bad idea all around. Of course, he's not listening. He says we're being paranoid, or at the very least just one more shot and we can go. At this point, we hear a truck coming along down the road from further up the mountain, and every last one of us is hoping we found a reasonable bunch. And then comes this pickup, full of folks. They're in the cab and in the bed. It's like they formed a posse just to get to us. And they're pissed. Confused, but pissed. They start grilling my aunt about what we're doing here, and before we can answer, here comes my cousin. They seem even more baffled when they see this city boy with his fancy camera, and my cousin flawlessly integrates himself into speak. Thankfully, they were nice enough people. Once they realized my cousin was there just to take photos, they dropped the anger and were just picking on him about not listening to the no trespassing signs. Turns out they just monitor Rebel Rock pretty intently, because teenagers and younger folks like to come out there and party, drink, do drugs, and trash the place completely. It's just super frustrating for them. Not to mention pretty pricey when they have to have all the garbage hauled away. They were baffled when they got to us, as it was one teen, some middle-aged woman, and some dude with a camera. They let us off the hook and my cousin got his pictures, so it ended well, but Christ. Just the realization you're being watched in the middle of the woods and just hearing that noisy-ass truck slowly making its way to us was absolutely horrifying. I didn't think I had a story, but then I remembered an encounter I had in a wooded area. This took place probably close to 10 years ago now. A friend of mine and myself had gotten into exploring supposed haunted places, and she had a lot of encounters down by a creek that ran through some woods by her house. We had a lot of weird things happen down there. Nothing stranger than this last encounter. It was myself, my then girlfriend, my friend, and her boyfriend that decided to go for a walk around dusk. We were making our way along a path that followed the creek bed that ran into the old house that crossed the creek, but had been washed out some years back. The side of the road that we were making our way to went behind and led into my friend's neighborhood. We reached the road when I had to relieve myself, so I told the group to go on and I would meet them up there shortly. I made my way down a slight embankment and posted myself up against a random bush. I remember thinking if we were in a horror movie, I would be the first to get killed. While relieving myself, I saw a white flash. At first, I thought nothing of it. My mind was playing tricks or something. I saw it a second time and thought perhaps fireflies, until I saw the flash a third time and what appeared to be a substantial shape moving behind the bush. I immediately thought it was a jogger in white running suit, and thought they were about to see me relieving myself on this bush, so I quickly finished up trying not to expose myself to a complete stranger. However, what I saw was not a jogger. On the opposite side of a creek, I saw a dull white humanoid figure that was featureless make its way up the path. I stood stunned for a moment and called out to my friends. However, only my friend's boyfriend came, and we stood there watching this thing move silently up the path for a moment. He went to get the flashlight that his girlfriend had, so we could get a better view of this thing. As soon as he got back with the flashlight and powered it on, this thing moved behind a tree. Our girlfriends made their way back to where we were standing to see what all the commotion was. This thing was long gone. My friend's boyfriend and I made our way down into the creek and across to the path where we had just seen this thing walk up. We followed the path and made it to the tree. There was about a 5 or 6 foot gap between the tree and the path we had seen this thing walk behind, but the drop was about 30 feet, and the path actually made a 90-degree turn and went up a hill. I don't know what this thing was. I believed it to be a ghost, and that it couldn't have cared less about us. At no point did it even appear to notice that we were watching it. We were watching it for a good 10 seconds or so. As we made our way back to my friend's house, we also heard this weird moaning sound, and what sounded like a metal striking rock or something. It was like if you were digging with a shovel into a rocky soil. After what we had just witnessed, I didn't want to find out what was down there, so we just hightailed it out of there completely. A couple of years ago, a girl in my small rural town went missing walking home from a nighttime church group. I was in the car with my mom one day a few months after that, when she said she noticed a road she had never paid attention to before and had a strong feeling that she needed to turn down it. She didn't tell me this, of course, and I was terrified and confused when she got so quiet. She told me to stay in the car, hopped out in the middle of nowhere, and walked off into the woods. She came back after about 10 minutes looking upset and confused, having not found anything to rationalize her weird feeling. She didn't tell me why she'd stopped until a couple weeks later, when the girl's body was finally found on the same road, about a mile from where we had stopped. I used to joyride on back roads and drink a few beers, etc. One time this gated Forest Service road was open where it was normally locked, and this road led 10 miles into a place called Ramsey's Draft, where it's also near a place called Confederate Breastworks where they used to make and store ammo during the Civil War. Anyway, we drive down this road and it eventually dead ends into a heavily wooded valley. There's a trailhead there into the draft, so we hop out of the truck and walk around to piss and drink beer. Immediately, me and my two buddies get a feeling something is off about this place. It felt like somebody was watching us, so we did what any logical dumbasses would and we split up to look around. I was about 100 yards from the truck and I stumble upon a campfire that was recently smothered out, like a few minutes ago. Next to the fire was a wooden stake in the ground, and resting on top of that stake was a fucking lit cigarette. I about shit myself, to be honest. I pulled my pistol out and quickly, but not in a panicked way, made my way back to the truck, where I found my buddies also with pistols drawn whispering, "We need to get the fuck out of here right now." And we did just that, and I've never been back. Not long after this happened, a man went missing from the Confederate Breastworks in Ramsey's Draft area. The story goes that he was confronted by some people that were hiking and was told to never come back, but for some reason he went back the next day because he left his cell phone or something, and he was never seen again. His name was Robert Fitzgerald. We think people were cooking meth back in there, or perhaps Irish travelers were hiding out in the woods as they were recently on the run for crimes in West Virginia around that time. I got loads of stories, but those mountains got some weird folks in them. Here's some backstory. There was a woman named Annie Motes who lived on the Virginia side of the Appalachian Mountain Range back in the late 1800s. Her husband used to beat her badly, so the story goes that she left one night and wintered across the mountain to the West Virginia side to be with her family. At the top of the mountain, though, she got caught in a snowstorm and froze to death. There's still a grave marker memorial where they found her body. I have a picture of it on my old phone somewhere. So, where she died, there is now a Forest Service road, and everyone says the road is haunted. They also say if you're lost at night up there that you'll see her lantern, and she'll lead you back to safety. Lots of hunters say that they have seen this floating light. So my buddy, like me, always used to drive around on the back roads to pass the time, and one night him and his sister were driving down the road near the Annie Motes marker, and suddenly this deer walks out of the woods and kneels on its front legs like it's bowing to them. Then he realizes his brakes were on fire, which was weird because they were driving very slowly in four-wheel drive. So he gets out to try to get the fire out of his wheel, and suddenly his sister starts screaming and thrashing around in the passenger seat like she's being attacked by something. He hops back into the car, brakes still on fire, and reverses the hell out of there as fast as they can, just to keep driving until they were out of the mountains. His sister had scratch marks all over her backs and arms. It was weird as fuck. I saw them too. He took his Jeep to the mechanic the next day to figure out why his brakes were on fire, and the mechanic ended up saying that there was nothing indicating that they were on fire at all. I was traveling down south and stopped in a little town that anyone from the north going to the south knows, right on the West Virginia, North Carolina state lines. I was staying at the Ramada there, just outside of town. It's the typical strip of hotels, motels, and a truck stop right along the freeway. I decided to go stretch my legs and walked behind the motel where there was this big field that was just along the freeway. The sun had just set, so the sky still had that light that makes light-colored things glow a little. I don't know exactly why I went back there, especially alone, but I was just standing there. I started to feel uneasy. Then I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye in the field. I looked hard and could barely make out something white. I knew there were a lot of feral cats and kittens around, and thought it might just be that. Just as I started to realize that this was a bad idea, the little white thing became big and was moving at speed in my direction. I sprinted down the parking lot and towards the office without slowing down to look behind me. I knew whatever it was still coming, by the looks on the faces of the people unloading their cars for the night as I was running past. Suddenly I heard a scrape, a scream, and a splat. When I turned around, there was a scrawny woman splayed out on the sidewalk, matted hair with dried and fresh blood on her face. She was screeching like a banshee. Someone had tripped her, not knowing what was going on. Long story short, she was in the field after getting dirty with a truck driver in exchange for meth. He punched her a few times, and she stabbed him. It turned out to be a minor injury because he was back at his rig and drove away, but later turned up at a hospital in North Carolina. I switched to a different hotel for the night, and when I returned home, I took a concealed carry class and got licensed, and now I have a little buddy that goes where I go, especially when I'm standing behind sketchy Appalachian hotels near truck stops in the dark. I was walking with my cousins about 14 years ago when we found what looked like an old burned-out house. So naturally, being kids at the time and having no sense of self-preservation, we decided to explore it. Mostly it was just full of charred wooden crap and junk, but then one of my cousins found an entrance to a cellar outside. We busted the old rusted lock off the door and looked down inside. It was dark down there, and we didn't really have any reason to go poking around. Plus, we were starting to get creeped out, so we kicked some dirt down into it and walked off. When we get about 15 yards away from the house, one of my cousins says he hears a noise, so we stop. And yep, there was a noise, like something coming up the rotting cellar stairs of the house. We peek back through the trees and see a dark, kind of fuzzy shape crawl out of the cellar which we had just opened. It looked kind of like a big old dog. And then it stood upright. We hauled fucking ass out of there. We all ran in different directions like morons, each of us convinced whatever the cellar thing was chasing us. I ran right through some briars in a panic and tore my arms and legs all up, which got me in trouble when I got home. We were all fine otherwise, but we did avoid going that far back into the woods again for a long, long time. Closest thing I can figure it was a small black bear living in the cellar. Maybe it had another entrance we didn't know about, and we woke it up being little assholes. But seeing something hairy and dark come out of that cellar and then stand up was like being in a horror movie. I never want to see that old house again. Back when I had just got my license, we would go camp up in the George Washington National Forest so we could drink a few beers underage and not get in any trouble. It was me and my two brothers and another friend one night. We had a fire going and played loud music and got really, really drunk. They all wanted to go back down the road to this cabin because they saw on the drive-in what looked like to be a party going on and we knew the cabin owner. So they went off in the dark walking to the cabin while I stayed back and tended to the fire. Anyway, a few hours later, like 2 a.m., they all stumble back and our one buddy is complaining that these people stole his cell phone. He wanted to go back and get it, but we told him we'll stop in the morning to look, just to go to bed. So the next morning we pack up and head back down the road to the cabin. And as I'm driving down the road, out of nowhere, this dude flies out of the woods and starts beating on the hood of my truck. He was completely covered in blood. We all get out and we tell him to back up and try to figure out what the hell is going on. This dude says that people in the cabin took his phone and beat the shit out of him. Not a good situation. So we go down to the cabin because I wanted to see if the owners were there. They were not. The people staying there were what we described back in the day as, quote, devil worshippers. You know, back when the whole, quote, satanic panic was going on. Anyway, my buddy is frantically looking for his phone, and the bloody guy comes down to the cabin, and this huge goth guy comes out of the cabin and just starts beating this guy with a log. I tell my buddy and my brothers that we have to leave now. Fuck your phone, and we got the hell out of there. I think we called 911 once we got back into service to tell them what we saw, but never knew what happened after we left. In May of 2003, I was fresh out of high school and had just joined the Marines. There was a period from when I joined until I could go to boot, so it took a few weeks to sign up for a survival camp. A local company in Gatlinburg offered survival techniques over a 10-day period. We met at the Elkmont campground in the Great Smoky Mountains with a group of 5 other survivalists, a group leader, and his assistant. They would stay with us for 3 days and show us techniques. Things like setting up tents, identifying local flora and fauna that was edible, how to set traps, etc. Each of us were given a backpack with items that you may commonly carry when hiking. Chapstick, binoculars, some protein bars, a lighter, matches, and we were allowed one personal item. I brought a small hatchet as I knew what items was included in the backpack from the start. In case you don't know, you can walk down the Elkmont Trail and you run into an abandoned town. It's an eerie place, especially on a dreary day. The town was all but abandoned in 1992 when the leases expired and people living there left. There were a few people living there until about 2001, and the last person left for good. All the places are kept up by the NPS, and they're all still well preserved from the logging town that it once was. So with approval by the NPS to use one of the buildings as a base for the first few days, we started our training. For the first 3 days, our group did several things. We used the Little Pigeon River to get water, which we like to boil for 15 minutes to kill anything in it. There are a few natural springs in the area that you can drink fresh, and the guide showed us those too. We also learned how to make lean, how to use rock walls to make shelter with fire heating it up to keep it warm, how to build hammocks out of kudzu vines, and what wild strawberries look like, along with several other things. We also made traps like snares and rock falls, along with making fishing line out of kudzu vines and making shift hooks, or finding fish in quiet zones of the creek where you could trap trout. We even learned how to make a fire with binocular glass and proper teepee builds for your kindling. After the 3 days, we were let go on our own. You would stay at the base camp, and the leader would walk you several miles into the undergrowth. Each of us were taken at different times and given a satellite radio in case we had an emergency. So we set off on our own and made the best of it. The group leaders would stay at base and wait 5 days, then come get you. Day 1, nothing out of the ordinary. I set a few traps, built a decent lean-to on the side of a large boulder. My fire is doing a solid job of heating the rock wall to keep it pretty warm inside. The air was crisp, but not quite cold. Some drizzle, but nothing more. I'm close enough to the river that I only need to walk 70 yards or so. I eat half of a protein bar and collected quite a few plants. The first night is quiet, and I only hear a few things out in the forest. It's very dark outside the firelight. I've collected enough wood to keep any critters at bay, namely black bears, as they can be very curious. I was awoken at some point in the night by the sat phone. Another survivalist is complaining about some large animal walking around his campground. He seems to believe it's a bear, but it sounded like it's walking on 2 legs. He never says anything else the rest of the night. My first night goes without incident. I will say that I found some tracks that looked human, but were indicative of a Bigfoot, as the footprint wasn't formed quite like ours. I wear a size 12 boot that I put my foot into the print, and it was a solid 5 feet longer. Now, there are several stories of the Tennessee wildman in this part of the country, and several of the stories originated in Cocke County, which is just on the north of the Sevier and Jefferson, on the other side of the Great Smoky Mountains. My grandfather owns a small cabin in Newport, and has told me stories about him hunting and something following him. I brushed those stories off until I saw that print. Night 3 is when everything went to shit. Around 1 a.m. is when I started questioning things when a large rock hit the back of my lean-to. I figured it was from the boulder and something simply broke off, as rock slides are common around here. After that woke me up, I grabbed the flashlight and assessed the damage. I rolled the boulder off the shelter, and it wasn't too far from breaking it completely. I half-assed fixed it and figured I would just fix it in the morning. I had caught a rabbit in a snare and cleaned it not far from camp, I'd say 100 yards off. I could hear noises from that area, but chalked it up to raccoons or a fox. I shined the light that way, but I saw nothing as the trees were too thick. Then something screamed. It sounded like a gorilla when it gets angry, followed by a coughing sound, like when a dog has drank too much water, that deep sound in the throat like it's clearing it out. I stood there frozen in this tiny clearing, thinking a bear is finishing off the entrails of the rabbit I cleaned earlier. I have no weapons other than my hatchet and a pocket knife. I come out of my trance and walk over to my backpack, never taking my eyes off the wood line. Everything in the night is quiet. I only hear the river running and the logs crackling. I sit down with my hatchet and throw more logs on the fire, hoping that it gets large enough to keep that thing at bay. I sit there for maybe 30 minutes, and I'm kind of dozing off. Then another rock comes hurling from the left side of the forest and falls 10 yards away from me. I know the boulder didn't do this based on where the rock came from. Now I'm panicking. I stand up, hoping to make myself look large with my shadow on the boulder behind me. I hear the cuffing sound again, and smaller trees further in are clearly moving back and forth rather quickly. I can see a large black shape moving around the firelight just at the edge of the end of the light, 40 yards in maybe. I can hear this thing breaking limbs, crushing leaves with every step. This thing was at least 8 feet tall, if I had to guess, but it was pretty far away from where I was. At this point, it's slowly moving away, but I could tell where the thing's head was, watching me, as every now and again I could see eyes shine. The sound started to get fainter and fainter, and I could hear it go into the river and cross it. That loud splash sound from the river as it crossed were only a few steps. It was about 20 feet across the river at this point. I sit back down and contemplated what to do next. It's around 2 a.m., and I have a few hours till daylight. I don't really want to walk the 4 miles back to Elkmont in the dark, especially in a place I'm not familiar with. Fast forward 2 hours, and it's 4-ish a.m. Suddenly, the sat phone turns on, and a guy is screaming into it. Something is trying to kill me. I've had several rocks thrown at me now. A large man is outside my shelter. I can hear it. This isn't a bear. I don't know what it is, but I need help. Silence. 15 minutes. 20 minutes go by. Another guy comes on. Something did that to me last night, but I thought it was a bear. I stayed here thinking I knew what it was. Rocks weren't thrown though, but I could hear it walking the perimeter of my camp. The guides must have awoken at this point, as the lead got on and said that they can call the park service to come get everyone. But that would be hours, and it's better to stay put and make do. So I wait. It's close to 5 a.m. now. If I can make it a few hours until daylight, I'm fine. All the forest sounds have returned. I'm still waiting, and around 7:15 a.m., I can see flashlights in the distance. The sun isn't quite up yet, but the eerie dawn light is filling the land. The clearing is still pretty dark at this point. I start gathering my things and start putting the fire out with dirt around the pit, and by that time out, the rangers are there with me. One of them was older and was clearly of native Indian descent. He said that there are stories of men in these woods that don't take kindly to people living off their land. I tried to ask more, but he said that we do not talk of these men. We walked back to Elkmont and met the rest of the group. One guy was clearly shaken up, and I assumed he was the one yelling on the phone. He only said its teeth were like apes, that he can't get those teeth out of his head. I still go to the Grand Smoky Mountains often, as my parents live there, and I still hike and camp, but I never go alone. Even as a former Marine and seeing some terrible things, I've never felt that primal fear as I did that night 17 years ago. When I was living in rural Appalachia a handful of years ago, I had someone, or multiple people, repeatedly harass me at night for over a year. I never found out who it was, but it might have been either an old friend of my grandfather's who was growing weed near my house, or possibly one of the people from down the mountain who used to dirt bike through the forest in the evenings. At the time, I would walk through the neighborhood and surrounding forest if I couldn't sleep. It was less of a proper neighborhood and more along the lines of 20 houses spread over a half-mile patch of dirt road. One night during my usual rounds, I began feeling as though something was watching me. I had seen wild animals during my walks before, including a bear, which, side note, was horrifying, so I decided to trust my instincts and go back to my house as calmly but quickly as possible. That eerie feeling of being stalked followed me all the way to my house. I admittedly was a bit too afraid to really listen for the footsteps or whatever was following me. I was 19 or 20 at the time, so the logic of, if I don't hear it, it isn't real, totally made sense to me. I got back to my house safely and went to bed that night sure that if I were to search the woods the following morning, I wasn't going to find any trace of what had been tracking me. Unfortunately, I was wrong. When I searched the woods the next day, I found a used condom right at the tree line beside my house. After that incident, I began hearing knocking on the wall nearest the tree line, tapping on the windows, and the sounds of people speaking. I did convince my mother to go check it out a few times. Whoever it was would already be loudly running back through the forest by the time she got around the house. Things got so bad that I was eventually, after months of dealing with these nightly occurrences and my grandparents refusing to let me do anything about it, was able to convince my uncle, who lived nearby, to put up a security camera. Unfortunately, it was the kind that only displayed a live feed, and he had it facing my front door instead of the woods. If you're wondering, I absolutely thought the entire setup was sketchy. He also insisted on monitoring from his house. He also insisted that he never saw anyone on camera. It was around this time that someone also sliced through the fabric cover on my grill and stole a storage crate full of my old clothing from inside a shed. Once the batteries in the camera died, my uncle declared that I had been imagining things, despite the damaged property and missing clothing. He insisted on removing the camera from my property entirely. Not even a week later, I was walking to my grandparents' house, which is a little more than 100 feet up the hill from my own house. I was going up there because I had forgotten to lock the door and they rarely did so themselves. I was in their driveway when I saw something duck behind the porch. I rushed back down to my house immediately and asked my mother to lock their door instead because I thought I had seen something. I didn't want to say that I had seen a person, because by this point my uncle and grandparents had me half convinced that my mother and I were really just imagining things. But no, long story short, she had to chase a man in light-colored clothing off of their property. She unfortunately didn't get a look at the man's face, but on the bright side, he ran into a tree. That last incident happened in November, and my grandfather's friend died that December. The strange occurrences pretty much halted after that point. Though the following year I heard a cell phone ring outside my window, someone broke into my uncle's truck and rummaged around, and my elderly neighbor had someone pacing her driveway during a power outage. Being from the city, and before that a railway town, I'm not exactly a stranger to creepy things happening at night or attempted break-ins, but there's something uniquely sinister when these things start happening in the middle of nowhere.